Hello everyone. We'll see the big picture very soon, but before that we have just one items left from the ER diagram. So uh, it is known as weak entity types. So we saw a couple of entity types, but there is one type of entity types known as weak entity. So there could be one entity type that doesn't have a key attribute of its own. If an entity type doesn't have its own key attribute, in that case it will known as a weak entity type. So example of an weak entity type is that from this figure and from our company diagram, if we think about the dependent relationship, okay, from the dependent entity type. Now dependent entity type, dependents are related with each of the employee. So if you remember what are the attributes of the dependent, each of that dependent has a F name, they have sex, birth date, and relationship. Okay. Now each dependent has a first name. All right. Now dependents are related with the employee, so it will be another relationship. Like we can form it as a has a relationship, like with employee. Okay. Now think about that. Each dependent has a F name, first name. But with the first name, we cannot identify each of the dependent itself. Okay. Only with the first name, we cannot identify each of the entities from each of the unique entities from the department. The reason is that F name can be, multiple dependent can have the same first name. So how we are going to identify each of the dependent? We are going to identify each of the dependent uniquely with the employee, okay, with a combination of employee and the first name. Okay, so to identify each of the dependent, we need the SSN of the employee, with the SSN of employee and the first name of the dependent. That will be a unique record for each dependent. All right. So if we have a entity type that doesn't have a key attributes of its own, okay, in that case this is known as a weak entity. So only F name cannot be a key attribute, right? So here dependent is a weak entity type. Okay, so if we have a weak entity type, in that case each weak entity must participate with an identifying relationship. Okay, they have to have a identifying relationship. Identifying relationship means each of the entity will be related with another entity, and this entity will be used for the will be used to identify each of the department. So there should have a relationship. Using the relationship, we can actually identify each of the dependent uniquely. Okay, so here this one is a weak entity type, and there has to have a identifying relationship with a owner entity. So employee will be here a owner entity, and as the owner, employee is helping the dependent to identifying each of the record of its dependent. Here the relationship known as a identifying relationship. And identifying relationship, we are going to show the identifying relationship using a diamond shaped but with a double number, with a double line diamond shaped. Okay, so all right, so here the attributes that is going to identify the dependent, the key attribute from the owner table, and there will be a attribute from the department table. Okay, there will be attribute from the department table, but only this attribute is not a key attribute for the dependent. I'm sorry, I'm saying department, it's not department, it's a dependent table. So Each of the key for this dependent table will be a combination of the partial key for the weak entity type. In that case, if it will be the fname, and another thing will be the particular entity that they are related with the identifying entity type. Okay, and the key attribute of the owner entity. Okay, so the attributes that will identify each of the dependent will be the combination of SSN and fname. Okay, so here fname by itself, it's not a key attribute of the dependent, but it's a partial key. Partial key means the fname will be used as one component to identify the dependent. Okay, the fname will be used with the key attribute of the owner entity. Okay, to identify each of the dependent table. So the dependent entity is identified by the dependent's first name, the specific employee with whom the dependent is related. So here dependent, the fname is the partial key. Dependent is a weak entity type. Okay, and employee will be the identifying or owner entity type, and there should have been a identifying relationship. Okay, and the identifying relationship, if the relationship is identifying relationship, we are going to show them using the double diamond shape. Okay, so I think we already know everything about ER diagram. So we are going to see the big picture, and we'll talk about that step by step. Okay, all right. So we had the initial diagram for each entity. Okay, we had the employee, each of the attributes. Each of the attributes, SSN is the key attribute, but employee had another two attribute in our initial design: department, okay, and supervisor. Okay, so department has another attribute, manager, and manager start date. And employee has another attribute, works on, which was multi-valued attribute. Works on had the project and hour. All right, so let's just look at these two tables, and we are going to see how actually we are getting all this relationship. We already identified all the relationship from the attribute, right? If one attribute is coming from another entities, means actually we should connect them as a form of relationship. So employee has a supervisor attribute, but the supervisor is also another employee. So that's a relationship between employee to employee. So if that's a relationship, we are not going to use that as a attribute. What actually we are going to do, we are going to actually show them, represent them as a relationship between entities. So now we are going to represent them as a supervision relationship, and that's the relationship double diamond shaped. And the both entity types are the employee. So you can see that here we have, it's a binary relationship, but the both entity but the supervision is connecting on both sides, they are connecting employees. Now as this is employee on the both side, we have to identify the role. Okay, so in this side we have the supervisor, and in this side we have supervisee. Based on that, we'll identify the cardinality ratio. Okay, cardinality ratio. Now supervisor to supervisee, that's a 1-to-n relationship. One supervisor can have multiple supervisee, but each supervisee will have at a time will have only one supervisor. Okay, so employee has a department table. Each employee works in a department. Now department comes from actually the department table. So instead of having it as an attribute, we are going to represent them as a relationship. So between employee and department, we have this works for relationship. Okay. And what is the cardinality ratio? So one department can have multiple employees. Under one department there are multiple employees, so that's a n, but each employee works in only one department, so that's a 1. N to 1 relationship from employee to department. Okay. Now this one, in this relationship, this one is a total participation, because each employee must work in a department and each department must have a list of employee. Okay, that's a total participation. So we are seeing the double line here. Okay. Now department has a manager and manager is an employee. Okay, so that means that will be also a relationship. So we are not going to use that as a attribute. So that will be another relationship. Okay, managers from department to employee, and that is a one-to-one relationship. Each employee can be a manager. Each employee can be a manager only for one department, and each department can have only one manager. So that's a one-to-one relationship. Now here, and we also talked about this example, each employee may not be a manager, right? So that's a partial participation, but each department will have a manager, so that's a total participation. Okay. Now what about the start date? So when we are actually thinking about manager as a relationship, so this start date is actually related with this relationship, right? So if the attribute is associated with the relationship, in that case we are going to use the attribute as an attribute of this relationship. Okay, like that. Now this will be a attribute of this relationship, managers. All right. Now we have another here, works on. Works on come from a project. So here it will be a relationship between employee and project. Okay, employee and project, and that's a M2N relationship, because multiple employee can works in the same project and one project can have multiple employees. Okay, so that's a M2N relationship. Now what about this hour? So this hour is associated with the works on relationship, right? How many hours each employee is working in a project. So that's actually a attribute of this relationship. Okay. All right. So we had for the project, we had a attribute controlling department, right? But here department is coming from this department, means it's a relationship. So we are going to cut that. It will not be a attribute anymore. It will be a relationship between project and department. And you can see that each project is controlled by only one department, but one department has multiple projects. So that's a 1 to n. Okay. Now as a participation, each project must be controlled by a department. Okay, so that's the total. Now there could be a department that doesn't have any project. Okay, so that's a partial participation. Now here we have the dependent to employee. Okay, so we said that dependent is a weak entity type. If a entity is a weak entity, for the weak entity type also we are going to represent them as a double rectangular. So it's a weak entity type, and it will be related with the identifying relationship with the owner table. Okay, with the owner table, and the relationship we are going to show them using the double diamond shaped. Okay, and here name, you can see that the name we are using the dash here instead of the straight underline. We are using the dash underline, means it's a partial key, okay. All right, so only one thing is left here. We are seeing one attribute, and where the attribute is like with a oval but a dash oval. So it means it's a derived attribute. The derived attribute means is that let's say we want to find out the number of employees in department. So in that case, we do not have to have explicitly, we don't have to have a column. Okay, so this number of employees can be derived from the from the other entities, and from it can be derived from this diagram. It can be derived from this diagram. So number of employees, I do not need to have as a specific attribute. It should be derived from the whole diagram. Okay, so when department is related with the employees, using some information and relationship, I can find out the number of employees for each department. So that's a derived attribute. Okay, all right, so this one is our final ER diagram, and here there are a couple of other things, and we have actually talked all of them. But we are not in this example today, we are not going to talk about ternary relationship. We'll talk about in the next class. But here we have the summary of all the symbols of the diagram. Okay, so this one is for entity, weak entity, relationship. Weak relationship means identifying relationship, attribute, key attribute, multi-valued attribute. So if the attribute is a composite attribute, that's how we represent them. That's for derived attribute. And these are the relationship. So here says that E2 has the total, E1 has the partial participation. So E2, here the cardinality ratio is 1 to n. Okay. So another type of another way to show the cardinality ratio using min max, but we'll talk about that in our next discussion. Okay, but now we know everything about how to draw a ER diagram. Okay, there are some different format of ER diagram, but here we are seeing only one format of ER diagram where we are going to show the relationship using cardinality ratio and existence dependency, total or partial participation. All right, so we'll see you in the next class.